Johnny Sher has been my biggest inspiration in this hobby, in this sport, and I'm sure he has been for countless people out there as well. And he doesn't really explain his methods, but it has become a hobby of mine, a hobby within a hobby, to try and figure out how I can get my quad to get the same kind of footage that he gets out of his quad. And it's kind of wild to think that I and you and everybody are flying a similar thing that he is flying, but in his hands he can do so much with it. So a big disclaimer up front here: please don't take me so seriously. I am just sharing whatever knowledge I might have. I do not speak from an authoritative point about anything at all, even though it may sound like I do. I do not, and I am not. Please don't take me so seriously. This is just advice to help everybody else out there, and that's all me and my channel is all about. With that being said, let's discuss some of the issues that we have when flying our damn little quads. So I'm going to focus on video here, and this discussion is primarily going to be about cameras and kind of photography. I do have a minor photography background. I have taken some classes in photography, like actual professional classes. I'm also a dentist, so I do arguably fine photography on a regular basis, so I have to kind of know some of this information. And the main thing I'm going to focus on here is Jello. If you don't know what Jello is, then this video is probably not for you, and it's probably going to be kind of over your head. So why does Jello happen? First and foremost, Jello happens because of the way the shutter works. And let's backtrack a little bit. Cameras, video or still, have shutters. Even video cameras, they have shutters. The frame is captured every so often to give you 30 frames per second, 60 frames per second, whatever frames per second. But that doesn't tell you the shutter speed of the camera. If you go up to 60 frames per second, it doesn't mean that the shutter is opening and closing 60 times a second. It could be opening and closing much faster than 60 times a second. It just happens on a beat of 60 times per second. So the shutter is the most important thing in this discussion of Jello. And the two shutter versions that I'm going to discuss here is global versus rolling shutter. The reason why I'm going to talk about global shutter is because that's what our CCD FPV cameras are. The old CCD HS1177 or the Micro Aero or the Micro Runcam Swift, these cameras use a global shutter. And the difference between a global shutter and a rolling shutter, I'm not going to put too many visual aids up, I'm just going to explain it. A global shutter captures the entire image at the same time, and the whole picture is processed together at once. A rolling shutter scrolls through the screen and captures the image line by line. So it's a constant scroll through the screen. It's a rolling shutter. Because a rolling shutter doesn't capture the entire image at one instance, it takes time to actually capture the image. There is a time period of capturing that frame, whereas a global shutter is a single instant capture of the image. The reason we get Jello is because the camera is shifting in the middle of its capture of each frame. And so you get this jarring effect in the camera, and that's why you get this wiggly appearance of the Jello. And that's where the term Jello comes from, because it's all wiggly. Now that we know what causes Jello, I'm going to introduce another concept called motion blur. Motion blur is exactly what it sounds like. It's blur when there is motion. And the reason I bring this up is because Jello and motion blur kind of go hand in hand. Now I'm going to discuss how you avoid Jello and how you get motion blur. But first, my settings. So I personally don't set a thing on my GoPro. I leave it totally default, except that I change it to 2.7K 30 frame per second Superview, and I turn off image stabilization. The camera manages its own ISO and its own shutter speed, and I don't even set what shutter speed it's at. Whatever is default is default. And it does a pretty good job of managing the dynamic range of lighting. It works pretty far into the evening, and it works in pretty darn bright settings. So they've done a really good job of managing the shutter speed and the ISO there. I just wanted to show you these filters that I'm using. So these filters that I'm using are, they're neutral density. They're called neutral density filters. I have gone through numerous companies, numerous products, looking for a product that I can actually produce and sell or offer as a product for everybody. you may know that there's a TBS Jello guard that is pretty much just a neutral density filter, and that's been around for quite a while. I didn't know I think it actually comes with 3 different darknesses, so this stuff is already available to you. And I didn't know that because Piraflip doesn't actually have them, because it's apparently difficult to get stock of them. So what they are is, these particular ones are just glass. I have tried a number of plastic ones. I've tried a number of film ones, stick-on ones. They just don't compare to glass. Yes, you can get some that are pretty good, but glass is just easier to get the clarity right and get the density right, so that you don't have to mess with anything. And I'm going to pull them up to the camera, and you can see some of them are just darker than others. So how do these filters actually prevent Jello from happening? Well, it's actually not very complicated, but I do need to introduce 2 other concepts before I can fully explain this: shutter speed and ISO. So I've now introduced a bunch of concepts. I hope it hasn't been too confusing, but ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor, the light sensor, the actual image capturing device inside the camera to light. There is a certain sensitivity that the sensor has to light, and the camera automatically manages what that sensitivity is. Additionally, shutter speed is also automatically managed by the camera, and what shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. It's how fast the shutter is opening and closing to capture the image. Like I said before, the shutter is not necessarily opening and closing 60 times or 30 times per second. Now let's discuss how the camera manages these two. If there is not enough light for the camera to actually capture the image, well, it needs to increase the sensitivity of the sensor in order to capture the light and get the nice image. Another option is for the camera to open the shutter so that it can gather more light. And open the shutter, I mean actually spend more time to capture the light coming into the lens. Now that's a very important idea, which I'll get to in a second. So the combination of managing the sensitivity of the sensor along with the shutter speed, or how long the frame is actually taking to be captured, is how the camera manages the dynamic range of lighting conditions. If you go into a dark room, the camera brightens up and compensates for that less light, for the less light in the room. If you walk from a dark room to a bright scene outside, the camera needs to compensate for that bright scene. And it does so by making the sensor much less sensitive to light and making the shutter way faster so it sees less light per frame to capture the image. The way we get rid of Jello is by keeping the shutter open as long as we can per frame being captured. And that means that even if there is movement in the camera, then you will not see Jello because the frame has been open for so long that the movement has occurred and passed and gone before the image is completed being captured. So let's look at an example. If there is way too much light, the camera needs to make the sensor much less sensitive to light and also make the shutter speed very fast. The shutter speed might be in excess of 2000 frames per second, but it's being done on a 60 frame per second pace. So most of the time, the shutter is actually closed during that 60 frames per second. But because there is that time between the shutter being closed and the next frame being captured, you have the potential to capture some movement within that frame. If you can get the shutter to stay open the maximum amount of time between frames, then the movement being captured turns into blur. And blur is not seen as Jello because there isn't a jarring of the image from frame to frame. This is how you get rid of Jello. Now, how does an ND filter actually prevent Jello from happening? Well, it just blocks light. It's a neutral density filter. So it has some degree of density and it blocks out light so that the camera sees less light, and it needs to make its sensor more sensitive to light, increase its ISO, and open its shutter for a longer period of time in order to capture the light and get a proper exposure. So the reason why I've gone over all of this is because the camera that we're using is actually technically a very rudimentary camera because it does everything automatically, and professionals generally don't do things so automatically. They like to have complete creative control of their environment to to get the image or video that they want to get. But GoPro has not given us complete control, and in fact, we don't want complete control. It's actually better for the camera to do some things automatically. As we previously discussed, the GoPro has an extremely wide range of light capturing ability. It works really well in a dark setting. It works really well in a bright setting. It's just that we're putting it on these little quads with spinning props super fast that causes the Jello, which is annoying, and we actually move quickly. But remember, we talked about motion blur. So the camera's goal is to get a properly exposed image with as little motion blur as it can get. But that's not what we want. This is kind of a creative and artsy discussion. We want some motion blur because it smooths out everything and it just looks very pretty. So motion blur. Motion blur is the goal. And like I said, the camera has a limited amount of motion blur that it allows itself to capture. And the maximum amount of motion blur that it captures is a little bit too much blur for me. I would rather it not have the maximum amount of capture. I would rather have some motion blur, but not too much and not too little, such that it looks like a flip book. And I'm showing you a video right now which looks like a flip book, and it's like frame by frame. If you pause the video, you just see a frame. It looks like nothing's happening. There's no action, there's no movement, there's nothing. It's just a still frame. That's not good either. It looks very weird to me. And that's why I think people really prefer 60 frames per second, which I'll get to in a second. But getting that correct amount of motion blur is actually a serious challenge because there's a really, really small area where the camera gets some motion blur, but not too much and not too little. And that's where I would really like the camera to be finely tuned to so that it gets some motion blur. I wish there was an amount of motion blur setting in the camera. Before going any further, let's talk about my Premiere settings that I use in order to kind of compensate for the video. I do use Premiere to edit. I do not have a clue what I am doing. I pretty much just look at how-tos on YouTube and figure out things here and there as needed. I do a very minor amount of editing. I pretty much do the exact same thing on all of my videos, whether it comes out of my GoPro or my phone or whatever. I add the brightness and darkness or shadow highlight filter, which allows me to adjust how much it lightens the shadows or darkens the highlights and makes it look a little bit HDR and kind of interesting. There's also one additional setting that I set with this particular filter, which is the radius of whatever on the highlights so that it doesn't give you this really abrupt change from a bright area that's been darkened to a dark area that's been lightened. It makes it look a lot more natural and not so obvious. Of course, these stock filters don't really do the best job, so I just work with what I've got. After that, I add a levels filter and proc amp, which I don't even know what proc amp is. Whatever it is, it's got a saturation option, which I just set it to 120 or 122. So 20 or 22% more saturation because I like colors. And then I add levels and I reduce the black level input or whatever that one is on top, just so that the dark shadows that I have now made lighter don't look washed out because I don't like a washed out image. The resulting image will look relatively higher contrast, but you will be able to see better shadows and you will have more color, and you can compensate for a scene that's too dark or too bright within reason. You can't go crazy, and I like lightening up the shadows more than I like darkening the highlights. So now let's discuss 30 versus 60 frames per second. This is a very personal choice. A lot of people like watching 60 frames per second. A lot of people prefer 30. Some people prefer 24, like movies. I personally hate 60 frames per second, but I do believe it has a place, namely in sports or fast action where you want to see the action. And I personally think that movies should have a variable frame rate where there's some action, the frame rate should speed up to 48 frames per second, not 60. It should never go to 60. It's too much information. There's some research that I've read that actually says that the reason why 30 or 24 frames per second is more enjoyable to watch, or at least one of the reasons, is because your brain actually doesn't get all of the information. You actually have to fill in the information yourself, and that stimulates the brain, makes it more exciting to watch, and it seems to be more engaging. But I don't know if that's actually true. I personally like 30 frames per second more from a technical standpoint because pretty much everything is in 30 frames per second. YouTube is pretty much the only, YouTube and Vimeo and these video streaming things on a computer are pretty much the only things that'll stream 60 frames per second or higher, and that's only if you ask for it. Most of the time it'll only stream 30. Instagram is only 30, Facebook doesn't like working with 60, it only likes 30, and so these are the platforms where we share our video and our information on, so we have to stick to their formats. But how do we optimize 30 frames per second? Well, with a little bit of motion blur, and then it makes it look super smooth and super nice. Then we don't even need the 60 frames per second. Additionally, let's talk about 1080p versus higher resolution. More resolution is always better to me. I don't know if anybody really prefers lower resolution. I think people just prefer 1080p sometimes because the GoPro or camera that they're using will actually do 60 frames per second, and they want the 60 frames per second because it has a faster shutter so that you get less jello and you get more motion, and that's why they like it, maybe. But I want all of the resolution, and I want all of the clarity and sharpness that I get with higher resolution. And so the best setting on the GoPro for what I want and what I am looking for, and generally is what's well known as the best setting on the GoPro for most use, is 2.7K 30 frames per second Superview. And I'll talk about Superview also. But in general, 1080p is really, really low. I mean, that resolution is tiny. It's like 2 megapixels or something. I mean, when was the last time you shot a picture at 2 megapixels? Like, who wants that? So 2.7K is really the benchmark at this point. Now let's discuss Superview. Superview is probably the single most important feature for flying a mini quad, and that's because we're always in motion and we're always moving. We're always moving the camera around. The frame of reference is constantly in motion. And when you have a really wide field of view, when you move the camera around, it doesn't actually look like it's moving so much. So that's why our flips and rolls don't look so ridiculous and crazy when we're watching them, because doesn't actually look like it's moving. When you're looking at the GoPro Superview footage, you can see like 170 degree field of view. So if you turn 90 degrees, you could have already seen 90 degrees before you turn. So your eye isn't like jarred over to the side to a new frame, which it doesn't even know what it's looking at. This is also the reason why it's very, very difficult to run anything other than a super wide angle lens or camera on a mini quad, because if you have a lens that's a little bit longer or a narrower field of view, even tiny movements in the sticks will look like massive movements in the camera, and it makes the video unusable completely. And it also has a higher tendency to capture jello and have other issues. It's just a mess, and it's very difficult to manage. And this is the main reason why I'm not a fan of the Runcam 3 or whatever the Cube GoPro Mimic whatever was, because it doesn't do Superview, or it doesn't have a wide enough field of view to look nice. Now there are some cameras that have sort of similar Superview or a really wide field of view, but GoPro has done something magical such that the Superview doesn't look as distorted as something on like a Xiaomi or some other camera. And that's what the magic of GoPro actually is, and that's to me why the company has value, because of this intellectual property and the methods that they use to capture this very nice, pretty image that nobody has been able to duplicate since. I haven't seen any action camera that can give me a picture that's even remotely similar to GoPro's Superview, and it doesn't look distorted. It looks very pleasing to watch. The horizon doesn't look wavy. Maybe there is, maybe I just haven't seen it, but I'm really impressed with GoPro's ability to do that. Now let's take a look at the quad and settings on the quad. So this is the quad that I was flying in all those videos. This is my oldest and hardest flown quad that I have. I have gotten sand in these motors numerous times. The bearings are completely shot, and it's just a totally damaged quad. And you can fly pretty much any quad and get really good smooth video if you know what you're doing and you get things working right. So first and foremost, your quad has to fly half decent. You have to have a half decent tune. Stock Betaflight, stock Butterflight, stock RaiBlocks, stock whatever these days flies pretty darn well, and it's adequate to get really smooth footage. If you want to get, primo stuff, doing really close proximity and really exacting moves, you're going to have to tune your quad a little bit. And this quad now, after several months, does have a little bit of a tune, minor tune. I only tweaked the P's a little bit. And I'm going to put my settings up on the screen here for you, but these are very personal settings to me and my quad and the way I fly, although I pretty much just copy and paste all my settings across all my quads because I'm way too lazy to deal with tuning and really setting up the quad for what's best for me. I just try to adapt with my hands. Let's get back to the quad. So these motors are not the best motors, and many times I have flown around with wobbly props or bent props, and I still don't get Jello, which is really, really nice. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that the filter is doing its job, and also the firmware does a really good job of managing the wobbles and Jellos with the props, which I don't know how they do, but it's pretty amazing nowadays how these things fly. Even though I said that you can use pretty much any quad, I have had some issues with motors in the past, and they have just happened to be lower grade motors. The higher grade motors, which I would say are $14 motors and up, any motor that you're spending $14 on and up that's of reasonable size is going to be pretty decent, and you should be able to get a pretty good flying quad out of that motor. But with lower end motors, namely, I'm going to name it here the RCX 2205, way back when. The H2205 was the worst one I had, which the firmware was really garbage back then, and it did not compensate very well. But I did have this issue where the quad would just wobble slowly in the air when it was at 0 throttle, and it was because the motors were just not really well balanced. When I swapped the motors out to another very cheap motor, it flew great. So I would say that it's not impossible to have motor problems, although I wouldn't say you really have to focus on your motor problems. Focus on your motors in order to get a really smooth flying quad. All this is really left up to another video. You can look at numerous videos online about how to tune your quad, get it flying right, but in general, you just have to have a really right flying quad. You can also have GoPro mounts that have like this gel underneath it, or this moon gel or whatever, and UmaGod has a grip, UmaGrip or Uma gel, whatever it is, something he puts under his GoPro when he straps it down that does help with some vibrations. But again, if you're trying to aim for the nice smooth footage that I personally like, and trying to get that shutter speed in the right zone to give you the nice motion blur and still give you a really good sharp picture, then you're not really going to need to care so much about that stuff. And you don't really need to care so much about the quad, because the amount of motion blur that I personally like just hides all of that stuff. So to summarize everything, ND filters reduce Jello, but you can also use them to block out light and get motion blur, which makes your video look very pretty and very smooth. It hides a lot of imperfections in your quad, as well as a lot of imperfections in your fingers when you're moving the quad around. The cameras that we are using to record footage have a relatively wide dynamic range of lighting conditions that they can manage, and so we don't actually need to mess with too many filters in order to set the scene and get the type of footage that we want. We can let the camera do most of the work for us. But it does take being conscious of the scenery and the surroundings and what you're doing and how you're doing and how you want to capture the image and how you want to capture the video to get the video that you want. I hope this was helpful, and I hope it helps you get the better footage that you're looking for. I'm still working on these filters. They'll come out probably at some point in time. They're not going to be too expensive. Unfortunately, they are just cheap glass filters. I've looked for the best quality stuff I could find, but the clarity definitely suffers on these cheap filters. We can't use the super expensive photo level, like high-end photo level stuff, because it's just too expensive to put on a quad. You're going to break it. I've already broken a couple of filters, so it's unfortunate that it is what it is. These machines are made to be smashed and bashed, and that's just the world we live in. I'm considering doing another one of these kind of videos, sort of about stabilization software, at least the stuff that may be more available to us. I kind of sort of don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but if you guys really want it, I will consider doing it, but that'll take a little bit more work because I have to do more work on the computer in order to show you guys everything. Please floss your teeth, because that's always important, and take care. Bye.